The first thing Eli Carter ever said to me was not hello. It wasn't welcome or glad you could make it, or any of those warm, ordinary things that humans say when another human enters their space for the first time. No. The first thing Elias Voss said to me, still in his dress shirt with the top two buttons undone, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a phone pressed to his ear with the other, standing in the doorway of the most beautiful, coldest penthouse apartment I had ever seen, was this: "You won't last a week." He didn't even look at me when he said it. He said it the way a person might observe rain coming through a cracked window, factual, unbothered, already certain of the outcome. And I, 23 years old, suitcase in one hand, a folder of freshly signed employment contracts in the other, 3 months behind on my student loans and desperately, embarrassingly in need of this job, stood in that marble-floored entryway and felt something sharpen inside my chest. Something that had no business sharpening, something I absolutely should have swallowed. Instead, I set my suitcase down. I straightened my spine. I looked directly at the side of his face, at his sharp jaw, the faint dark circles under his eyes, the way he held tension in his shoulders like a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he had forgotten he was carrying it at all. And I said, "I'm not leaving, unless you fire me." He paused. Just for a moment, barely half a second, the phone lowered slightly from his ear. And then he turned, and for the first time, Elias Voss looked at me, really looked. Dark eyes, unreadable, cutting through me like a scalpel looking for something soft to wound. He didn't find it. Or maybe he did and decided it wasn't worth the effort, yet. He turned back to his phone call, walked deeper into the apartment, disappeared around a corner without another word. And from somewhere behind me, the building's concierge, a kind, weathered man named Mr. Donahue who had ridden up with me in the elevator, leaned in and whispered, "For what it's worth, son, that's the longest any new hire has held his gaze. The last one lasted 4 days. My name is Noah Reyes. Was a graduate student in art history, passionate, idealistic, and at 23 completely broke in the specific, grinding way that only someone who spent 4 years studying things that don't pay bills can be. When the listing appeared, I thought it was a joke. Live-in personal assistant to prominent architect and founder of Voss Design Group, Elias Voss, 29, competitive salary, full accommodations in private penthouse suite. Required, exceptional organizational skills, discretion, resilience, and the ability to maintain composure under pressure. Note, this position has experienced high turnover. Candidates must be prepared for a demanding work environment. High turnover, that was the polite phrasing. What it actually meant, as I would learn, was that 6 assistants in 18 months had walked out that door, some after days, one after a single afternoon. The agency that placed them had started including a quiet disclaimer: "We recommend candidates with exceptionally thick skin." I needed the money. I submitted my application. 2 interviews later, both conducted via video call with Elias' operations manager, a no-nonsense woman named Diana Park who had the energy of someone perpetually diffusing a bomb. I was hired. "He hasn't approved many candidates in person before offering the role," Diana told me during our final call. "He reviewed your file and said," and I'm quoting, "fine." High praise, apparently. So there I was, suitcase in hand, standing in the entryway of a penthouse that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed beauty and warmth were mutually exclusive. All clean lines and cold marble and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering sprawl of the city below. Beautiful, sterile, lonely in a way that pressed against the ribs. The apartment had 4 bedrooms. Elias used one. I was given one at the opposite end of the hall, separated by a living room, a study, a kitchen so pristine it looked like it had never cooked a meal, and roughly the emotional distance of an entire continent. The rules were delivered to me in a printed document the following morning, slid under my bedroom door at 5:47 a.m. Staff guidelines: Elias Voss residence. There were 11 of them. Rule 4 was, do not attempt casual conversation before 9 a.m. Rule 7 was, do not rearrange items on the main desk without explicit instruction. Rule 9 was, do not ask personal questions. And Rule 11, the last one, added in different ink as though it had been written separately and later, reads simply, "Do not make this complicated." I read it 3 times, then I folded the paper, placed it in my drawer, and went to make coffee. I had a feeling Rule 11 was the one I was already failing. Here is what I learned about Elias Voss in the first week. He woke at 5:30 a.m., ran 6 miles on the building's rooftop track in weather that would make reasonable people stay inside, was showered, dressed, and at his drafting table by 7, worked with an intensity that was almost physical, a visible pressure in the room like the air changed when he was focused. He did not play music. He did not hum. He worked in silence the way other people breathe naturally without apparent effort, as though sound itself was an intrusion. He drank too much coffee and too little water. He ate when reminded and forgot when not. He kept a sketchbook that he never let leave his sight, its cover worn soft from years of handling, filled with drawings I caught glimpses of when he left it open, not architectural blueprints but something else. Smaller, more personal, I never asked. He was, by most observable metrics, extraordinarily difficult to like. He was curt. He had no patience for inefficiency or vagueness. He corrected mistakes without softening the correction. He moved through his own space like someone who had made a private arrangement with the world. I will demand excellence from everything, including myself, and in exchange you will leave me alone. He was also, and this is the part I had not prepared for, the part that made everything complicated, brilliant in the specific, devastating way that artists sometimes are. The kind of brilliant that you feel in your sternum before your brain catches up. The kind that makes the air around a person seem charged, like standing too close to something electrical. I saw it first on day 3. He had a client presentation at 10. I had prepared the materials, printed the schematics, organized the portfolio, confirmed the conference room. Standard, clean, I was fairly proud of it. He looked at the materials for 45 seconds. Then, without looking up, he said, "Asterisk, the Meridian project visuals are sequenced wrong. They should build emotionally, not chronologically. The client needs to feel the building before they understand it." He didn't say it unkindly. He said it like a man observing a mathematical fact. I took the materials back. I resequenced them, not randomly, but thinking about what he'd said. Feel before understand. I thought about the way stories work. The way a good painting pulls your eye to the emotional center before you notice technique. When I brought them back 20 minutes later, he flipped through them once. He said nothing, but he took them to the presentation. That evening, Diana messaged me, "Client signed the contract." He never thanks people directly, but I've worked with him 3 years. The fact that he didn't reassign you to filing is basically a standing ovation. I stared at my phone for a long moment. Then I laughed quietly into my coffee. It was Rule 4 he broke first, not me. Day 5, I was in the kitchen at 7:15 a.m., well within the no casual conversation window, making his coffee the specific way that had taken me 2 days to calibrate, 2/3 of the way through the press, not fully steeped, poured at exactly the right temperature. I had quietly become a little obsessive about getting it right. He walked in, poured himself a glass of water, which I noted silently as a minor miracle, stood at the window looking out at the city still purple and gray with early morning. Then he said, without turning around, "What did you study?" I paused, looked at the clock, 7:16 a.m. "Art history," I said, "graduate level, focused on 20th century architectural theory." Silence. "Then that explains the resequencing." And he walked out of the kitchen, back toward his study, coffee forgotten on the counter. I stood there. I picked up his coffee, followed him to the study doorway, set it on the corner of his desk, within his reach but not in his way. He didn't look up. But one hand reached for it immediately, the way you reach for something you already knew would be there. I went back to my tasks, but something had shifted. Something quiet, small, like a window opened in a room that had been closed too long. By the end of week 2, I had developed a private, carefully guarded theory about Elias Voss. He wasn't cold, he was defended. There's a difference. Cold is a temperature, defended is a structure, something built deliberately, maintained with effort, rebuilt when it cracks. Cold people don't notice the small things, defended people notice everything, they just refuse to let it in. Elias noticed everything. He noticed when I moved his coffee 2 inches to the left to keep it off the corner of a blueprint, and said nothing, but never put his coffee on blueprints again. He noticed when I replaced a bulb in the study lamp before he mentioned the room had felt dim. He noticed the afternoon I got a call that made my voice go flat and professional in the way it does when you're performing calm over something that isn't calm. That night, a takeout order arrived from the Italian place 3 blocks away. My order exactly, including a tiramisu I hadn't asked for. No note, no explanation. When I mentioned it the next morning, he looked up from his work with that unreadable expression and said, "You hadn't eaten. How did you?" I noticed things. And he looked back down. I stood in the doorway of his study for 3 full seconds, doing something extremely undignified with my face. Then I left and I thought about Rule 11. Do not make this complicated. I thought he wrote that for himself as much as for me. Week 3 arrived with a crisis. The Harlow Tower project, Elias' largest active commission, a 40-story mixed-use development that had consumed his professional life for the past 2 years, hit a structural design challenge that threatened to push the construction timeline back by 6 months. I understood perhaps half of the technical details, but I understood all of the human details. 3 sleepless nights in a row, meals forgotten entirely, a tension in the apartment so thick I could feel it pressing against the walls. I did not ask questions. I did not offer comfort, which I had a strong instinct he would not want. I did what I could, kept the coffee coming, kept the schedule cleared, fielded every call from Diana and the project team so he wasn't interrupted with logistics he didn't need to handle. On the third night at 1:17 a.m., I woke up because the apartment felt wrong. I don't know how else to describe it, some shift in the quality of silence. I got up, went to the kitchen for water and found him at the drafting table in the living room, which he only used when the study felt too confining, with paper spread across every surface and his sketchbook open. He was drawing not blueprints, the smaller, more personal things I'd glimpsed before. I should have gone back to bed. Every sensible instinct said, leave him alone, this is not your space. I went to the kitchen, made tea, not coffee. It was past 1 in the morning and brought a cup out without a word, set it at the one clear corner of the table, started to leave. The problem, he said quietly, is that I built this tower for a view that doesn't work. I stopped. The structural engineers want me to shift the central atrium west by 4 meters, which is technically correct, which solves the problem, he paused, and which means the sunrise hits the atrium floor at the wrong angle, and the whole reason I designed it this way, the whole emotional reason, disappears. I turned around, looked at the blueprints, then at his face, which was doing something complicated, something that looked, for a single unguarded moment, like grief. What was the emotional reason? I asked. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought I'd overstepped, that he'd retreat back into the careful architecture of distance he lived in. Then he said, my father died in a hospital room with no windows. I was 17. I kept thinking, someone designed this room, someone chose not to give him a view of the sky. The room was very quiet. I have spent 12 years, he continued, still looking at the blueprints, designing buildings where people can see the sky. I didn't say anything immediately, because some things deserve silence before they deserve a response. Then I moved to the table, looked at the blueprints. I didn't have an engineering solution. I was an art historian, not an architect, but I thought about the problem the way I thought about all problems, structurally and emotionally at once. What if you didn't shift the atrium, I said slowly, but changed the reflective surface on the east-facing interior wall, redirect the light rather than the structure? He looked at me. I felt immediately, acutely aware that I might have just said something embarrassingly unqualified. I don't know if that's technically. It would require a specific grade of treated glass, he said, already reaching for a pen, and a recalculation of the interior thermal load. He was drawing as he spoke. But the load-bearing adjustment is minor. The angle would be, he stopped, calculated silently. The angle would work. He looked up. And the thing that happened in his face then, I have thought about it many times since, it wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more surprising. It was recognition. The look of a man who had been alone in a room with a problem for so long that having someone hand him even a fragment of a solution felt like discovering a door he didn't know existed. Go to sleep, Noah, he said, but his voice was different. I went to sleep. I lay in my room with my heart doing something entirely inappropriate and thought, Rule 11, do not make this complicated. Too late, already complicated. Already completely, helplessly complicated. He didn't bring up the 1 a.m. conversation. But something shifted in the apartment's atmosphere, like a barometric pressure change before whether you can't quite name yet. He was still curt, still demanding, still moved through his own world with that careful self-containment. But the edges had changed, or maybe I had changed and was seeing them differently. He started talking through problems out loud when I was nearby. Not asking for my input, just thinking aloud, the way some people think better when they can hear their own voice shaped by another person's presence. I learned to listen and stay quiet, and to speak only when I had something real to offer, and somehow he seemed to understand this about me without us ever discussing it. He learned my coffee order. I didn't tell him. One morning it appeared on the kitchen counter and I stood there genuinely confused until I realized he had noticed. Diana called me at the end of week 3 and said, in a tone of barely concealed shock, he asked if your accommodation was adequate. He has never once asked that about anyone. What did you tell him? I told him I'd ask you. It's fine, it's more than fine. A pause, then Diana warmly, don't let him scare you off, he's a good person, he's just forgotten how. The sketchbook came into my life by accident. Day 26. I was reorganizing the study, a task I'd been given explicit parameters for, and the sketchbook slipped from the side of the desk and landed open on the floor. I picked it up. I should have closed it. I kept my eyes on the page for exactly 3 seconds longer than I should have. It was a drawing of the city at night from the penthouse window. I recognized the particular angle, the specific cluster of lights. But the drawing had something the actual view didn't. In the lower corner of the window, reflected or imagined a figure, not detailed, just the suggestion of a person standing in warm light looking out. It was the loneliest drawing I had ever seen. I closed the sketchbook, placed it back exactly where it had been, left the room. Thought about that drawing for the rest of the day. Thought about the man who had drawn it, so precise in his professional work, so controlled, so armored, quietly sketching his own loneliness into the corner of a page he never showed anyone. I thought about Rule 9, do not ask personal questions. I thought about how rules are sometimes built to protect the person writing them. It was a Tuesday, week 4, when everything cracked open. He had a dinner. Business, I assumed. He had several that month. Client relations, the social performance of being Elias Voss, brilliant and intimidating and carefully, deliberately inaccessible. I had prepared his schedule, confirmed the reservation, made sure his phone was charged. He came home at 10 p.m. instead of the expected midnight. Which I noticed because I was still at the desk in the study, organizing the Harlow Tower revised drawings. I heard him come in. Heard the particular sound of a person moving through their own space with something heavy in them, not loud, not dramatic, just the subtle compression of a difficult night. I stayed where I was, that seemed right. 15 minutes later, is there coffee? I can make some. Don't bother. Silence. Then from the living room, he asked about Marcus. I didn't know who Marcus was, but I recognized the weight in those 4 words. The kind of weight that comes with a name that belongs to a particular kind of loss. I left the study, stood in the living room doorway. He was at the window, always the window, jacket off, looking out at the city. Who's Marcus? I asked quietly, knowing I was breaking Rule 9, choosing to. He didn't answer immediately. The city glittered below us, somewhere far down, a siren. Someone I used to know, he said. 3 years ago he left because a pause, precise and painful, because I am very good at building walls and very bad at letting people pass them. He told me that, almost exactly in those words. I stayed in the doorway. The client tonight knew him, thought it was funny to mention it, an observation about patterns. His jaw tightened briefly. He wasn't wrong. Does that matter to you? I asked, what the client thought. No. Does Marcus matter to you still? A longer pause. What matters, he said quietly, is the question of whether I'm capable of being different, or whether I've just built the same structure so many times that the blueprint is permanent. He turned then, looked at me, and for the first time, Elias Voss looked not like a man defending himself from something, but like a man genuinely uncertain of the answer to his own question. Open, in the specific terrifying way that people like him are only briefly open, a door that swings wide for a moment and then closes again unless you move fast enough. I walked into the room. I sat down on the couch, not close but in the same orbit. The geography that says, I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. Blueprints can be redrawn, I said, you do it all the time. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he sat down too, not close but in the same orbit. We sat like that for a while. The city moved below us. The silence was different from all the previous silences, less defended, less heavy, something closer to the kind of quiet that two people can share without it meaning nothing. Eventually, I made the coffee after all. He didn't stop me. We didn't talk about anything deep for the rest of the night. He showed me a structural problem in the revised Harlow schematics. I made an observation about sightline psychology that made him go quiet in the way he went quiet when something landed correctly. We worked until midnight, side by side at the drafting table. When I finally said goodnight and went to my room, I stood inside the closed door for a full minute and told myself very firmly all the sensible things. You work for him, you live in his apartment. This is a professional arrangement. He is your employer. He is private and defended and has given you every reason to maintain distance. This is not. It didn't work. It doesn't work when something is already what it is. Love, if that is even the word for what grows between two people slowly and without permission, does not arrive like a declaration. It arrives like weather, gradually, then all at once in a moment so ordinary you don't see it coming. The moment for me arrived on a Thursday morning in week 5. He was at the kitchen counter with his coffee and the morning's project notes, reading with that focused stillness that I had come to know. I was across the kitchen making breakfast. Neither of us had ever established this as my job, but neither of us had questioned it either. It had simply become something that happened. I cooked because I found it grounding and he ate because I had learned what he would eat and when. The radio was on. He had never turned on the radio before. I'd turned it on 3 weeks ago to a soft classical station and waited to see if he'd turn it off. He hadn't. By week 4 he'd started reaching over to turn it on himself if I forgot. A piece came on that I recognized, Sadie, one of the gymnopedies, that particular kind of music that occupies the same emotional space as late afternoon light, quiet, aching, lovely. He looked up from his notes, not at me, just up, the way you look when music catches you in something private. And I watched his face do something it almost never did, not the careful professional expression, not the defended wall, just softness, brief and real and unguarded like a man who had forgotten for 3 seconds to guard himself. Then he looked down, went back to his notes. And I turned back to the stove and thought, oh, this is a problem. Because it wasn't admiration, what I felt. It wasn't even attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was something more complicated and more dangerous. It was the specific tenderness of knowing someone, not the version they present to the world, but the version that slips out in the early morning over coffee and Sadie. The version that draws loneliness into the corner of a sketchbook page. The version that designed a 40-story building to give people what his father never got to have. I was in serious, irreversible trouble. He caught me once looking. Week 6, we were in his study late reviewing Harlow presentations for the 3rd time that week. I was sitting across the desk, papers in hand, and he was looking down at a drawing, and I don't know, the light was particular, or I was tired, or the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of close proximity had worn something down. I was looking at him when he looked up. He caught it, that specific look, not professional, not neutral, the real one. Neither of us said anything. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the room was absolutely still. His expression did the thing it had been doing more frequently lately, that subtle shift from defended to uncertain to something I couldn't read from the angle I was at. Then I looked down at my papers, cleared my throat, said something about the schematics. He looked down at his drawings. We continued working. But the room never entirely settled back to what it had been before. It was like a table that has been slightly moved back in position but not quite level, everything resting at just a faint tilt from where it was. It was Diana who named it, with the particular directness of someone who had watched Elia's Voss cycle through more assistants than she could count. She called me on a Friday afternoon, and after a brief professional update she said, "He submitted your 6-week review to HR yesterday. Already. He does them early when he decides he wants to keep someone. He almost never decides to keep someone." A pause. "He rated your performance as exceptional in every category." He also added a handwritten note which he has never done. What did it say? She was quiet for a moment. Then, asterisk it said, Mr. Reyes has demonstrated an unusual capacity to understand what a space needs, both professionally and otherwise. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. What a space needs. He had said it about architecture. He had said it about me. In a sentence that blurred the line between the two with the particular precision of a man who was very careful about everything he chose to say. Week 7 brought the thing I should have expected and had foolishly convinced myself might not come. His name was Julian Ashworth. He arrived at the apartment on a Wednesday evening, invited by Elias, which itself was notable because Elias almost never invited anyone to the apartment. Tall, easy, the specific kind of handsome that announces itself in a room, an architect in his own right, apparently, an old friend. I answered the door. Julian looked at me with a curious, not unkind expression and said, "You must be the one who's lasted more than a week. He mentioned you." He mentioned me. He said his new assistant was different. That's basically a declaration of love from Eli. He said it lightly, a joke, but something in my chest did not receive it as a joke. I brought them drinks, stayed at the periphery, available but not intrusive. But I was aware with a sharpness I did not want to be feeling of how Elias was with Julian. Different, easier. The shoulders slightly lower, the pauses less guarded, the language of someone in the presence of a known quantity, history made visible in the grammar of how two people occupy the same room. Later, when Julian had left and I was clearing the living room, Elias appeared in the doorway. "You were quiet tonight," he said. "I was working," I said. "Noah." Something in the way he said my name, just my name, and yet entirely not just my name, made me set down what I was holding and turn. He was leaning against the doorframe, that expression again, the complicated, unreadable one, but there was something else in it tonight, something that looked almost like, "I see what you're not saying." "Julian and I have a history," he said, briefly, years ago. It ended the way most things in my life ended back then because he stopped. Chose words carefully in the way he always chose words when they mattered, because I was better at building walls than being present. "You don't owe me an explanation," I said. "I know I don't." A pause. "Then why are you explaining?" I asked. The silence stretched. Outside, the city buzzed its constant low note. "Because," he said, and his voice was slightly different, careful and deliberate in a way that meant the words were important. "I am attempting, imperfectly, to practice being different." I stayed very still. "Then you were," I said. "Then I was." Another silence, but this one was not empty. This one was full of everything that had been accumulating for 7 weeks in coffees and late nights, and shared silences and blueprints spread between us at 1 a.m. and all the small, specific, unremarkable moments that had built, without permission, into something that had weight. I started. "You should," he agreed. I picked up the glasses, carried them to the kitchen, stood at the sink with the water running and the city lights spilling through the window and my heart doing something it had absolutely no authorization to be doing. From down the hall, I heard his study door close. Not slammed, closed, the specific sound of a man who needed to think and chose a room to do it in. I stood there until the water went cold. The Harlow Tower crisis, the revised version, the one that had followed my 1 a.m. suggestion, had a secondary complication that arrived in week 8. The structural engineering firm raised an objection to the treated glass solution. Viable, they agreed, but the specific grade required was on a 4-month import lead time. The construction timeline was already compressed. Elias had approximately 48 hours to either find an alternative source or revise the solution. I had been awake since 5. I had made 17 calls by 9 o'clock. I had sourced 3 alternative suppliers, 2 of which were marginal possibilities. I was on hold with the third when Elias walked into the kitchen, looked at me, looked at the stack of notes I'd built, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. "Then why?" I put the phone on speaker, "Because it was your solution and I don't want you to lose the window." He sat down at the kitchen table, something he almost never did. He ate standing, usually, or at his desk. He sat, and he looked at me with that expression that I had learned meant he was doing something difficult. "You're not supposed to work pre-9 a.m., he said. "I believe you're conflating 2 different rules. Rule 4 is no casual conversation pre-9. There's no rule against working." I wrote those rules. I know the ink on Rule 11 is different from the rest, you added it later. A pause, his jaw did the tightening thing. You notice things, he said. I notice things, I agreed. The hold music cut out. The third supplier came back on the line with an answer that was almost what we needed. I negotiated for 12 minutes, got them to a delivery window that was workable, confirmed the specifications, ended the call. Elias was still sitting at the kitchen table. The window will hold, I said. He nodded, once, slow, but he was looking at me with something that was past the professional assessment, past the careful calibration of appropriate employee regard, something honest and undefended and slightly terrifying in its openness. Noah, he said. Elias, I want to say something. Okay. And I need you to know that I am aware of the position this creates professionally, and I've thought about this considerably. Because you work for me and you live here, and I don't say things I haven't thought through. My heart was doing something architectural, building something it didn't have a blueprint for. When you came here, he said, I told you wouldn't last a week. I remembered. I said it because every other person had left, and because, he paused, the careful word-choosing pause, asterisk, because I have learned to preempt things that are going to hurt by treating them as already inevitable. The kitchen was very quiet. You didn't leave, he said. No. You resequenced a presentation based on emotional logic. You found a glass solution at 5 in the morning. You sat with me at 1 a.m. when I was losing a building I'd spent 2 years on. You asterisk another pause shorter, you turned on the radio. I almost said something completely undignified and managed not to. What I'm trying to say, Elias said with the particular expression of a man dismantling a wall he himself built, is that I don't want you to leave, not because you're good at your job, though you are, but because... He stopped. I waited. Because this apartment feels different when you're in it, he said, and I would like that to be allowed to mean something. The morning light came through the kitchen window at its specific angle. The city hummed below us. The coffee machine completed its cycle with a soft click. I looked at Elias Voss, defended, careful, quietly brilliant, sitting at his own kitchen table doing the bravest thing I had watched him do, which was say a true thing plainly, and I felt the accumulated weight of 8 weeks settle into something that was not complicated at all. It means something, I said. He looked at me, and the expression that crossed his face briefly before he controlled it, before the careful composure reassembled, was the same expression I had seen on a Thursday morning over Sadie. Unguarded, soft. Real. Okay, he said. Okay, I agreed. Here is what I want to tell you about love in the way I have come to understand it. It is not the dramatic moment. It is not the declaration in the rain or the perfectly timed confession or the grand gesture written by someone who has never watched two careful, complicated people slowly figure out how to exist near each other without anyone getting hurt. It is the Tuesday evenings when he brings my coffee without being asked and sets it exactly where I can reach it without looking up from my work. It is the Sunday mornings when I make breakfast and he turns on the radio himself, now the same station always, and we occupy the kitchen in easy parallel silence. It is the night he showed me the sketchbook. Week 9, late. He placed it in front of me on the study desk and sat back and looked at the ceiling, as if examining the geometry of the room, as if watching something else entirely, as if it was not the most vulnerable thing he had done in our presence. I opened it. I looked at every page. The city at night, always from this window, always with that small figure in the corner, sometimes at the desk, sometimes at the window, sometimes simply there. The building studies and the architectural dreams and the personal drawings that had nothing to do with professional work. The careful, precise rendering of a man processing his world through the only language he fully trusted. Near the back of the book, a drawing I recognized from its angle. The kitchen morning light, a figure at the counter. Me, from behind. Just a suggestion, the way all his figures were suggestions, but unmistakably the particular angle of someone who has been seen, quietly and carefully, while going about ordinary things. I closed the book. I looked at him. He was still examining the ceiling. You've been drawing me, I said. I draw what's in my space, he said carefully. Elias. He looked at the ceiling for another moment, then looked at me. Yes, he said simply. Some things don't need to be narrated in real time. Some things are private, held between two people in the specific way that the most important things are always private, not hidden, but belonging only to themselves. What I will tell you is this. We talked that night until 3 in the morning, not about architecture or clients or project timelines, about his father and what it felt like to be 17 in a windowless room and decide quietly that you would spend your life making windows for other people. About my own circuitous route, the art history that everyone called impractical. The broke graduate student who applied for a job because the alternative was moving back home. About Marcus and what that had cost him. About the 6 assistants before me and what it had meant each time to watch someone leave. About Rule 11. I wrote it for myself, he said, as I had suspected. Because I knew the way you sometimes know things you're not supposed to know yet, that you were going to be different, that it was going to be that I was going to, he paused, precise and honest, want it to be more than professional. On day 1, I asked. When you said you weren't leaving unless I fired you, a pause, I remember thinking this person is going to be a problem. You could have fired me, I pointed out. I know. We looked at each other. Why didn't you, I asked. He was quiet for a moment, then, because I was tired, he said, of building walls instead of windows. Here is how it looked in the weeks that followed. Learning the new language of two people who have decided to try. The adjustments, and there were many, because Elias Voss at 29 was still a man who moved through the world with his armor on, still sometimes retreated behind the walls that had become habit before they became choice. He was not overnight transformed, he was who he was. But he was trying. That is the thing about defended people when they decide to stop. They don't throw the walls down, they learn to open doors. It's slower, it's less cinematic. It is, in my experience, so much more worth watching. He learned to say when something was hard. Not easily, it cost him something each time, and I watched him pay the cost and never made it smaller or larger than it was. I learned when he needed silence and when silence was avoidance and the difference between the two. We argued specifically and precisely, the way two people argue who both believe in the importance of words, and we got better at it, the way you get better at anything you do enough times with intention. He showed me his newest sketchbook. He didn't need to make it a gesture anymore. He just left it open, the way you leave a window open when you trust the air. I resequenced 3 more presentations. He stopped needing me to, he had started thinking about them differently. The Harlow Tower glass arrived 6 weeks before the revised deadline. I was in the study when he got the call. I heard him from the hallway, the particular silence that follows very good news, the kind you've been holding your breath for so long you don't know how to exhale. I brought him coffee, he was standing at the window. He turned when he heard me, and the expression on his face, the real one, unguarded and warm and entirely without architecture, was the most beautiful thing I had seen in that apartment, in any apartment. The glass, he said. I know. He looked at me for a moment, then, thank you for the phone calls at 5 in the morning. You can thank me by getting the building right. I'm going to get the building right. I know, I said, I've seen the sketches. He almost smiled, he was getting better at that. Epilogue what the window shows. The Harlow Tower opened 14 months later. I was there because I had been there through all of it, and because Elias had become the kind of person who asked people to be there for the things that mattered slowly, imperfectly, but with intention. I stood in the main atrium on opening day and watched what the light did. The east-facing wall was the specific treated glass that had cost 17 phone calls and one very early morning to source. The morning light entered it, fractured, and fell across the atrium floor in gold and warm white at an angle that made you stop, made you look up, made you understand before you had words for understanding it, why someone had built this the way they had. Elias was across the atrium in conversation with the project team, but he was watching me. When I looked up at the light and then across at him, I saw it again, that expression, the one that was his most honest face. I thought about a man of 17 in a windowless room, making a private promise to the world. I thought about all the buildings since, all the windows, all the views of the sky he had given other people. I thought about his sketchbook and the small figure in the corner of a city at night, drawn again and again until it wasn't alone anymore. He crossed the atrium, stood beside me, tilted his head back and looked up at the light the way I had been looking at it. "Does it work?" he asked. "You know it does. I want you to think so." "Why?" "Because," he said, "you're the one who found the glass." I looked at him, he looked at the light. "And because," he added quieter, "I build things for people I want to impress." I thought about everything I might say to that, all the precise and honest things. I settled on, "Then keep building." He turned, looked at me with that look, the real one, the no-walls one, the one he was still learning to wear comfortably and was getting better at every week. "I intend to," he said. A note on the first thing Elias Voss ever said to me, asterisk. "You won't last a week." He was right in a way. The person who walked through that door, careful, desperate, guarded in his own right, didn't last. But that is the thing about staying. You don't remain the same person, you become the person the place makes room for, the person the other person slowly, imperfectly learns to let in. He said I wouldn't last a week. I said I wasn't leaving unless he fired me. He never fired me. I never left. And that apartment, which had once felt like the loneliest beautiful place I had ever seen, became, quietly, gradually, the way all the most lasting things become, home.